This is Pastor Lane, and I am at George Boom Funeral Home right now. Tonight we have a few of our members who are here for a tour. We are going to not only see this wonderful facility, but we are also going to have a chance to ask some questions about what happens at end of life as far as it pertains to a funeral. And so tonight we are going to hear those things. I will try to be mostly quiet so that you can hear what's being said by the folks who are leading our tour. But the reason we're having this is we take our confirmation students here each year, our 8th graders, when we're talking about the life cycle. And they find it very, very interesting. And what we found was that the parents and grandparents who've come along as chaperones for that experience said, hey, that was so interesting. Why don't we have that as an opportunity for the whole congregation? Because while everybody eventually gets to this place with those that they love, we often don't really want to ask the questions ahead of time to know what to expect in the process. So hopefully tonight you can have a chance to not only see a nice, beautiful facility, but to think about some of those things in your own life. Some of you might have loved ones who have died recently. Some might be in the process of having a loved one who is dying. And all of us at some point should just be thinking about what we might like to have prepared so that those that we love can have as easy a time as possible when they begin the grieving process after we have gone. So I will try to be mostly quiet tonight so that you can hear the people who are leading us. But with that as an introduction, we are going to go into George Boom's funeral home, and Candace is our leader who is talking first.
The folks who have plans written down, they're usually talking about what color the flowers are going to be the day of the service and how much food to plan. And the people who haven't done any planning in advance are looking at each other with worried faces. And they're wondering, what would have mom wanted for the service? And how much is this going to cost? So right away, we kind of know how we can help families best. And the service part of that is that. So we're going to plan maybe a visitation. And the visitation is nice because we can honor personalization. There's pictures, there's videos. A lot of times there's a fact of death. You'll see a casket here. As humans, once we've done a viewing of the body, sometimes we don't know they've passed away. Include some sort of viewing. But that visitation time is probably one of the most important times of a service because we hear laughter, there is crying, but a lot of times we hear stories that people say, gosh, I never knew my dad did that, or that's the first time I ever heard that, or I didn't know he got into so much trouble because he didn't let us do those things. We had a visitation here once that if there was a viewing, but she was really into wine, and so the family served wine. And every time I walked in this room just to check to see if everyone was doing okay, everyone said, this is exactly what she would have wanted. This was perfect. As they were leaving, they were like, thank you, this was perfect. It honored her life exactly. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to make that visitation a direct honor of their life. The next part of a service that we see is usually the ceremony or religious component. Maybe at the church, sometimes it's held here, but it's going to be a reflection of the life well lived. Oftentimes there's stories or eulogies told during that. There's scripture read. Sometimes that scripture is helping the family process the death and helping them to move forward. Sometimes the scripture is your favorite scripture that you might have written down. Songs are sung. People participate in that service. We have grandchildren read scripture. We have friends do eulogies. But that is a good reflection of the life during that ceremony. The next part of the service that we might see too would be a procession to a final place of rest. And the procession gets us from point A to point B. But I think that there's a deeper meaning to a procession, and I really think it's time for the family to slow down and reflect not only on the life that they've lost, but maybe on their own lives, as well as the public. Here in Sioux Falls, people are still pretty good about pulling over and slowing down and honoring the procession that's going through. And I think it's an important time, if you've ever seen a funeral procession, to kind of reflect on that life and your own life, because life is very precious and it's very fragile. And sometimes in the busyness of what we do every day, we forget those things. What we found on those surveys that I was referring to a little earlier is that if a family took away any of those components of the service, they weren't as satisfied. And here's what that looks like. So we have a neighbor, and their kids have been gone for many, many years. And if they pass away, I don't want those kids to think, well, we moved away, mom and dad are in their 90s, we'll just have a private service. Because we have gotten very close to them, and the kids have gotten very close to them. So by eliminating that visitation time, you've now taken that opportunity for the family to hear great stories about their loved ones, but for friends to process the loss as well. So that's an example. A visitation is very important. Or they'll say, you know what, we're gonna do a cremation, and then we're just gonna take the urn home. Well, there you've eliminated two parts. You've eliminated the final resting place and the procession of slowing things down. Then suddenly, they have this urn, and they're not exactly sure what they're going to do with it. I actually met with a very close friend to do their advanced planning, and she said, I don't want to burden my family with having to come visit me at the cemetery. So we're just going to be cremated, and we'll give our urn to our son. And I said, I'm only going to say this to you this way because you and I are really close, so you don't want to burden them by having to visit you, but you're going to burden them by having your urn go home with them. And she was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I said, well, let me just give you an example. If my husband is cremated and I'm cremated and we give our urn to our daughter, now forever she's going to have to carry that around. And then let's say she decides to be cremated someday, and then her children have my urn, my husband's urn, their mother's urn. Who's going to keep all of these? So we do find later that families decide, you know what, maybe we should find a final resting place so there's a place to go and memorialize and remember. So those are some of the things by eliminating those things. The other thing that we hear a lot about is, I wish I would have written my plans down, or I wish I would have asked my husband what he would have wanted. We had this lady that we worked with very closely, and she lost her husband. And she ultimately decided to do a traditional service. So we had his body here. They used what's called a ceremonial rental casket, and we'll talk a little bit more about services. And then she had him cremated, and then she did do a burial. But she never knew if he wanted to be cremated, and it bothered her. And so we would talk to her, and we'd say, I'm sure it was okay. And she's like, I'm sure it was too, but I don't actually know because we never had the conversation. Communication is probably one of the most important things to have with your family, whether it's about anything, but particularly about funerals. In advance, you guys are holding what we call an emergency record guide. And in advance, you can actually write down all of your wishes. The emergency record guide would hold important information that we would need to complete the death certificate someday. It would hold important information on the instructions of the service that you want, down to the detail of how many ham sandwiches you want. We actually have a lady who calls us, and she's like, Candace, I'm 1 year older. You can take, I've lost this friend and this friend and this friend. You can take a whole dozen sandwiches off my, okay. So we update her record guide to make sure. But she's almost 100 now, and she calls us every year just to let us know she's okay. So you can write down all the details you want. Also in there is information about your family. That's helpful to us for the obituary, but it's really helpful to us so we know who we're going to be helping at the time of your death when you're gone. And then you can write down pallbearers. I know that seems kind of strange because you don't know how long you're going to live and you don't know who those pallbearers are going to be, but I wrote down my pallbearers because I want my family to know my thought process on who I wanted to be there. Pallbearers are those folks who carry us in life, have the honor of carrying us one last time. Pallbearers can be family, they can be friends, they can be men, women, nieces, nephews, they can be whoever you want. But I would recommend writing that down too so your family has an idea of what to do.
My mother got a letter out from Miller Funeral.
Yep.
And after she had signed up 10 years earlier, and that they asked her, do you want to change any of these?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And all the pallbearers had to be taken out.
We're completely different,
Yeah.
yes, yep. So the record guide is important to keep on file at the funeral home, okay? Then we'll check in with you once a year and say, hey, have you had any big changes in your life? We actually do it in a very tricky way. We call you, wish you happy birthday, invite you to have a donut and say, you know, by the way, is there anything big that changed? But then every 5 years, we do like to sit down with your family just to make sure there aren't any major changes in that record guide. So that would be a major change, especially if you've outlived all of your pallbearers, would be an example of that. So let's talk about services a little bit. Of course, there's the traditional casketed burial, and there's cremation. Who here is thinking cremation? Who here is thinking traditional burial? Who here is not really sure? Okay, A, communication. So make sure you do talk about that with your family and write that down. But let's talk a little bit about cremation. So cremation probably offers the most amount of services for families that we have. Because like I mentioned before, you can still have a traditional funeral with a viewing. We use what's called a ceremonial rental casket. So you don't have to purchase a casket. So your body is present for the visitation. Your body is present for the service. And then instead of going right to a cemetery, we would come right back here to the funeral home and complete the cremation process, which again, you'll be able to see the crematory a little bit later with Mitch. And so we call that, again, a traditional service followed by cremation. So it gives all aspects of the service. It lets people view if they need to view. And then, again, you can still do a burial of an urn in a final resting spot. Another pretty popular choice that we have is a cremation with a memorial service. So what we do in that case is we would do a private viewing with your family. When we do a private viewing with immediate family only, you do not need to be embalmed. And so we do allow there to be that ID viewing. You can take special time to just say your final goodbyes. We would complete the cremation process then. And then the urn would be at the visitation on something similar to this. This is an urn caddy. And so the urn would be placed there maybe with some pictures and memorabilia, so that the visitation can still happen. Even though there isn't a viewing, that visitation time to have fellowship and to get support from your friends is still very important. Then we'd have the memorial service, whether it's here or at a church or another place. And then we could go right to a final resting spot. And then we have another cremation option, which would be like a cremation with a graveside service or maybe a visitation, maybe not all the full services, but there's still some services involved. And then an immediate cremation with no service, which we don't see too much of that because we do still have a lot of traditional aspects here in Sioux Falls of folks who still want the support for their family. So there's lots of different options for cremation. Do any of you have specific questions about cremation services, cremation process, or anything you've ever wondered about cremation?
Well, I'll tell you how I'm doing mine.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Whoever goes first, my wife or I, the kids get to hold that urn.
Yeah.
And when the other one goes, then we're gonna have them blend it together.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then they're gonna go out to each of our parents and sprinkle some of our ashes on each one of the
Okay,
parents.
so scattering, yeah.
So they can keep as many ashes as they want for running around and, like you had said.
Yes, yeah.
Or they can pour them all out and have it all, so they don't have to
Yes.
worry about us anymore.
So if you're wondering, scattering is legal to do. There is a proper way of doing it. We can get what's called a permit. They just need to know the longitude and latitude of where that scattering is going to take place. And if it's private property, they do need to have permission of the landowner. So there is a way to do that. Go ahead.
Do you have to have a permit to scatter?
So you should.
Okay.
You should. As a licensed funeral director, you should have
Sure.
a permit to scatter.
Could you be fined or something like that if you were come upon by a police officer and you were just scattering ashes, I don't know, in your neighborhood,
I mean, I don't
the
know.
church lawn?
Here, I'll just tell you a story. Okay, so I was doing a seminar out in Mitchell, South Dakota. It was a packed. There was a lot of people, and And way in the back, we were talking about this, and someone had asked a similar question. And she said, they will find you. And I was like, can you tell me your story? Well, she was from a small town, and she had told somebody who told the register of deeds that she had scattered her husband. And the register of deeds, it's a small town, called her and said, where'd you put Bob? And so they got her a permit after the fact. So just when I said, you know, I don't know that anyone would say anything, she was like, they will. So it was kind of a funny story, but maybe
And,
it just.
and in South Dakota, they require that. In other states, they don't require a permit for scattering. But when you mention scattering, you want to be scattered on your parents' graves, I'm assuming. The big thing there is, does the cemetery allow it?
Is the cemetery gonna know about it?
Well, they will.
They will, because
They
you
will.
can seek them. Yeah.
And I always tell families when they say they're gonna scatter on a grave, you know, if you do it when it rains like it does now, just to be very honest with you, it clumps up.
It what?
It will clump up kinda like cement. Just to be very honest. Or, you know, when you scatter cremains, they do mow the lawns, things like that, so just keep in mind, when the mower goes by, you'll be on everybody else's grave too. So that's something to keep in mind. And when I encourage people to do, if you wanna be buried, you know, scattered in your parents' grave, just bury some of the cremains on your parents' grave, cause then you're always gonna be there, you know, and it's a designated spot.
I don't want them to work too hard at getting rid of me.
Well, it's not hard, and it's worthwhile because you're always gonna be there with your parents.
Yeah, right.
And the other thing that I encourage too is if you're not buried in a cemetery, I encourage you to place a marker, whether it's on your parents' lot, a family lot, because over time, you know, as you see people do family trees and all that, over time, your children, your grandchildren, when they pass away, who's gonna know the life that you lived if you don't have a place designated for yourself?
So
That brings up another question. Is it legal to bury ashes without some kind of permit? I know you can't just bury your spouse in your backyard, but what about their ashes?
You're gonna want the cemetery to know, and the cemetery is gonna want a record of it. So basically, from what I've seen over my career, even in rural areas, I've noticed a lot of them, you'll run into cemeteries, even in rural areas, where they'll have signs where there's no scattering on a grave.
Okay.
They're also gonna wanna know, and I'll just share a story with you. When I was a director in Minnesota, we had a casketed burial in a rural cemetery, and the gravedigger called me and he said, Mitch, when I dug the grave, I also dug up an urn. There's no marking on it or anything like that. It was just a family that came and decided that we're gonna bury the cremated remains on the family lot. But unfortunately, when he dug the grave for the lot designated for that person that passed away, he also dug up the urn. And there was no record of that. And it's very important for the cemetery to have a record of that too, because people will come and visit graves, especially when Memorial Day is coming up, which is coming up. People will call the cemetery all the time and ask, where is so-and-so buried? And they have that record, and they can tell them exactly where they need to go.
But there wouldn't be a problem if you had an acreage or a family farm and you took an urn home and put it under the favorite oak tree or something like that?
And I've run into that too, where I always tell people, you know, if you want to bury in a family farm, I visited with a gentleman, they lived in town, and he said, you know, I'm going to bury my wife's remains under her favorite tree. And then when he told me that, I just said, are you planning to keep the house in the family forever? And he said, no, probably when I die, the family will sell that property and that home. And basically what I told him is that that person that buys that house, that might not be their favorite tree. They might need to cut that tree down. They might need to dig up those roots. Then what happens to your wife's urn?
That's not to bury him in the urn.
Well, so, and I have a, you know, kind of, when I was working in Chicago, I had a woman come in and she was pretty upset. And I had several visitations going on, so I brought her into the office, and we had recently done services for her husband. And so she said, well, you know, everything was great for the service, but we decided to do scattering on our family property up north, and I just discovered I can't keep it. It's too much maintenance, it's just not something I can do. And so I said, okay, and she's like, I know, there's nothing you can do for me right now. And by the way, she wasn't this calm, she was crying a lot. So much so I actually thought she lost somebody else. And so I said, you know, so how can I help you? And she said, I know there's nothing you can do for me now, but you need to tell this story. Because in the moment, we thought it was the perfect thing to have him scattered in a place where he loved to go. And now that I've sold the property, I feel like I've lost him all over again. So what we did for her is we got a grave for her, but the monument has both of their information on it. So now their children have a place to go. So even though he's not there, he's there. And she felt a lot better about that. In fact, the cemetery behind us has several grave spaces that don't have anyone there, like Mitch mentioned. It's a place where people can still go. Because on Memorial Day, we'll see starting Thursday of Memorial Day weekend, this place gets really busy. And it gets busy because there's people here honoring lives lived. And they don't just drive by on 10th Street and say, love you, Mom. They come in, they go to the grave, they maybe clean a little of the grass off, they make sure it all looks nice, they have a moment, they place flowers in honor of them, and hundreds, thousands of people do that here. And so it is important to have a place to go.
I think for myself too, there's something about the community of the cemetery. You know, you're not just buried alone in the middle of nowhere, but there's a surrounding of the great cloud of witnesses, to use kind of biblical language and church language, that you might be gone, but you're a part of a community, has gone on together to be with our Lord and Savior, and as opposed to just kind of being off on your own in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's, to me, and maybe it's just goofy, but there's some sense of comfort about being together, even if it's a community of a cemetery.
To piggyback on that note, if you ever watched the play Our Town, it kind of reflects that.
Sure, yeah.
But my question was, I know that Hills of Rest has what they call double down.
Yeah, double death, graves, yeah.
Where whoever dies first, they go
Yeah.
9 feet down. And,
Yeah.
And then the next one goes 6 feet down.
Yeah.
A lot of people have taken that option.
So when Hills of Rest Cemetery was established, they did what was called lawn conservation spots. So meaning it's one grave space but holds 2 people. And the vaults were pre-placed. So when the cemetery was, you know, made and established, they were double depth vaults pre-placed. And so like you mentioned, when the first one passes away, they take the lid off the vault. There's a space in the middle, and then the first one is placed. And then after the second one passes away, they open the lid back up, and then they place the second one. It depends. You know, you asked if a lot of people take advantage of that. Some do. Some prefer to have their own spot. But it's only a small area out there that's that way. But our national cemeteries for veterans and our state veterans cemetery, that is how they are laid out, where it's double death. So the veteran and their spouse are actually in the same grave. And actually, in many of the national cemeteries, they're actually laid out to hold multiple people in the same grave, because if anyone had any dependent children, any veteran had a dependent child, they'd all be in the same grave.
They're all cremated, aren't they?
No.
Really?
Nope. No, in fact, in the national cemeteries, I'm told, at some of them, that they can actually have 6, because they can go 1, 2, 3, and then they do 1, 2, 3. So, but that would only happen if you had a dependent child. Your whole family can't be buried with you at the national cemetery unless you were deemed dependent or everyone was a veteran.
So you can't, on a regular gravesite, do a double down unless it's already pre-planned that way.
So it depends on the cemetery, and I know that's a broad answer, but even some sections in some cemeteries can't. So in some sections they can do a double death. It really just depends on the ground, and then in some areas of the same cemetery they cannot. So it really depends on the cemetery. And then we have some rural cemetery, you know, Mitch referenced some rural cemeteries, and sometimes rural cemeteries have a little bit more strict rules than than others, and it's for that reason that he mentioned, you know, needing to know where everything is. But we do have some rural cemeteries in the eastern part of South Dakota that no matter what, it's one person in the grave.
Yeah, I've been a widow for 30 years, and Stan was cremated because he died down in Arizona,
Okay.
and to bring back.
Yeah.
So we have a single plot, and his ashes are buried in that plot, and both of our names are on the.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like you kind of mentioned before, sometimes we will want to know, and if a national cemetery is your consideration, they will want to know, are both people being cremated? Are both people not being cremated, or is one being cremated, one not being cremated? Because it will have a difference on how we do the burial at the time of the passing.
Do you find in plots that are side by side, they like to choose by what side of the bed they sleep on?
I don't know. In many cases,
I'm always on the left side or the right.
In many cases, it's a traditional,
Sure.
you know, it's a traditional aspect. But yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I know. My husband would be like, yeah, other side, other side. So in addition to cremation, any more questions about cremation services? I do want to touch a little bit more on permanent placement. Like we discussed, if you're going to have a traditional service and you have a casket, well, of course, the casket will need to be buried, or we can do an entombment in a columbarium. So behind us, or in a mausoleum, behind us here, Hills of Rest actually has a mausoleum where people can be entombed above ground. But also urns can be buried, urns can be placed in columbariums, urns can be placed kind of anywhere. And out here specifically, we have a beautiful cremation garden where there are stones and benches and a bird bath. All of those items that you see there are actually final resting places for people. They just didn't want something traditionally in the ground. They wanted something a little bit different. And they all memorialize and kind of reflect their life. So it's a beautiful garden there. There isn't scattering that takes place here. Instead, we have an underground option, and it's called an ossuary. So what an ossuary is, there's a place at the top, and it has a little memorial stone at the top. That is removed, and if a person chooses, they can actually be commingled and placed underground. So it's like an underground form of scattering. And then their name can be placed on a cenotaph at the cemetery too. So there's lots of different options for final permanent placement of cremated remains.
My father-in-law bought 4 sites.
Okay.
It's a nightmare trying to get rid of them.
Oh, of grave spaces?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you have spots and you're trying to resell them, you do have to do it privately. And you actually can't sell them for any more than it was purchased for. That's a state law in our state, actually. So if you want to, I mean,
So what?
We see some people put them in the newspaper.
Yeah.
We also see some people who are just like, well, at this point, we'll donate them to a family in need or something like that. But unfortunately, the cemetery can't buy them back, and it would have to be a permanent sale, and then or a private sale. And then you just let the cemetery know that it went from this person to this person. So we have a legal record of that.
I have a friend in North Dakota with 6 plots. He keeps trying to get me to sublet them from him. So far, I've resisted.
No, yeah, you didn't take that. So I think too, if you're considering cremation a permanent place of rest, which we all have kind of touched on, is eventually important. Any veterans here? No? Or anybody, spouse of a veteran? Okay. If you know somebody who's a veteran, having their discharge document on file would be important. So as we touched on this record guide, holding all of the information, if cremation is something you're thinking about, or if cremation is something you wanted to change to, we should also put in your file what's called a cremation authorization. You can actually sign permission to cremate prior to your passing in the state of South Dakota. So if cremation is something that you'd like to do, we would recommend you have that on file. If you don't, your legal next of kin can give us legal permission at the time of your passing to do the cremation. So your legal next of kin might be a spouse, but if your spouse is deceased or the 2 of you have passed away at the same time, then it would be all of your children. So if you have 6 kids, it would be all 6 If one person says no, we cannot do the cremation at this point. If you don't have children and your legal next of kin are your nieces and nephews because your parents are gone and your siblings are gone, then all your nieces and nephews have to sign permission. So if cremation is something you want to do, it's important to meet with the funeral home that you'd like to use and have a cremation authorization placed on file. So that would be important.
Is it true that the people who are your next of kin can change all of your pre-planning? So if you say, I want to be buried in the ground, and they come in and say, no, we're doing a cremation.
So there's actually some legislation that's being kind of made to hopefully solidify plans that have been made in advance. It's always kind of been an understanding. If a person planned it and paid for it, usually it holds up. And I'll tell you, 99.9% of the time, if a family has planned it, they don't change it. They're just grateful their family planned that.
Sure.
If that is a worry of yours, because we do have families that come to us and say, listen, this is what I want no one to change it. We actually have legal documents that can be put in place naming a different person in charge of your final plan.
Sure.
So then that person knows it's not going to be changed in the event the children want to. Here's what we see. Here's how we see that happen. Religion is very important to maybe the parents, and then their child hasn't been to church since they graduated from high school, a personal choice. Then the parents are worried that now their service isn't going to be at the church, which was a huge part of their life. That might be a circumstance where they'd say, listen, I don't want this changed, so I'm going to put my pewmate in charge of my funeral because I know it's going to be there. We rarely see that happen. The most often times that we have problems is when an advance plan hasn't been made. The more arguments we see are actually when an advance plan hasn't been made. So when somebody hasn't written their plans down, that's when we see the most unrest when folks are coming in to plan funerals.
Are you seeing more and more people come in and asking for the pre-plan, pay up?
To pre-plan?
Yeah.
I have to be honest, after the pandemic, we did see a lot of people who said, I don't know what's gonna happen, I better get my stuff done. So we do have a lot of people, but there are different levels of advanced planning. Those forms I gave you, those are free record guides. We meet with people every day that we help them fill those out, we put them on file, and that's a free service we offer. You don't have to prepay if you don't want to. An advantage to prepaying here, and then I also manage the pre-planning department for Miller Funeral Home. It's the same department. We'll actually price protect. So even though the costs go up over time, if you prepay, you'll be price protected. They're also placed in a safe, irrevocable account. So your money is not with us, owners, okay? It's in a safe, irrevocable account. So if you move, it can easily be transferred. If the funeral home were to close, which it won't, but for whatever reason, if the funeral home closes, your money's not with the funeral home. It's in a safe, secure account that can now be used at a different funeral home. The other thing too that we see a lot of actually, nursing home care has gone up so much. We hear anything from $6,000 a month to $12,000 a month based on level of care. So if your assets are depleted and you have to go on Medicaid, your irrevocable plan with the funeral home is actually Medicaid approved and is not considered an asset of yours because it's irrevocable. So it's actually something they encourage you to do too. So every week we meet with families who are in a situation where their assets are being depleted due to care and they need to make sure their final wishes are taken care of. And that is something you can do. But your level of planning is completely up to you.
Yeah, we signed up this past last summer.
Yeah, good. So my recommendations to you before I let you go on a tour with Mitch would be to have a conversation with your family. And I know it's not an easy conversation to have, and it's not easy to contemplate your own mortality, but I will tell you from recent personal experience that it's easier to have the conversation when you can have a conversation without a diagnosis taking place or a death having just occurred. Tell your family that you made your plans so they know. And some families will be like, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. And other families will be like, okay, we'll talk about it another time, but I'm telling you right now, once they know that it's done, they're gonna thank you. I have my plans done, And I didn't know what was bothering, and they've been done for a while now, but when I got them done, it was like, oh, okay. I just kind of felt that much better to have it done and written down. So my husband doesn't have to take care of it. Plus I know what I want and I know what I don't want. Now the guys can take care of it if something happens. So have your
my wife to do her stuff for her.
have your record guide done. If you want cremation, get your cremation authorization done. And then any important documents that you think we should have, like a DD 214, should be on file at the funeral home. Any other questions for me before you go on a tour with Mitch?
And just to go off of that, you know, just stepping away, visiting with a family that just lost somebody, a loved one, I was able to look at their record. I was able to look at their file, look at their wishes. So when I talked to next of kin, I was able to go over information with them and explain. It was easy for me to ask questions because I knew what their wishes were. We have a photo for an obituary already in there. We have a lot of obituary information. We know where the service is going to be, where the burial is going to be at. So when we schedule a time for them to come in, which we did do, we're going to have an obituary pre-typed up for them to look at. And it's just going to be going through the steps, just verifying things and making sure everything's the way they want it, the way their mom or dad wanted it. So it makes it very simple for them, and the arrangement process will not be as long either.
And if the kids aren't thrilled about that.
Yeah.
And from a pastoral perspective too, and people don't often want to do this, but it's helpful if you've been a member of a congregation for a long time to share those things with your pastor as well, so that when they're visiting with your family, they can say, you know, your mother was a dear member here for a long time, and we know that she would like this, that, or this part of the church life was so important to her. You might consider, you know, giving memorials towards that, or you want to make sure that the paraments there look just like this, and those kinds of pieces as well.
Agree, absolutely. Yep. Well, thank you all for being here tonight in the weather, and it's not easy to come to the funeral home, but again, thank you very much. If you have any questions ever, you can always give us a call and contact us, and then Mitchell will be able to answer questions on the tour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, do you have any questions before we start the tour about anything?
How does it all start?
Okay.
What happens if someone passes away at 2 in the morning?
Okay, we will answer the phones immediately. We always answer our own phones here, so you will always get a licensed director. For instance, this evening I'm on call, so if something happens at 2 in the morning, my phone rings, I answer it personally. Okay, and we address those questions immediately for a family. Basically what will happen is, depending where the person does pass away, whether it's a hospital, care facility, hospice center, it could be unattended death at home. Most of the time, we're going to be contacted from whether it's a nurse at the hospital or care center, a hospice facility. Sometimes we're contacted by the police department if it's unattended death at a home. Sometimes we're actually notified by the family prior to the care center calling us or hospital just to let us know that we're going to be receiving a call, and then they visit with us a little bit prior to that too. But basically the first thing that happens, we receive that initial call. We will gather information from that nurse or whoever is calling us, basically who the individual is, where they're at, room number, next of kin, time of death, doctor signing, date of birth, and then after we receive that, then that's when we make that initial contact to family. Obviously, if we're here at the funeral home during the day, we can look to see if they have any information here. But if we're at home, a lot of times we don't have that in front of us, so that's when we ask the family those questions. In that initial call, you know, I'll give them my condolences, and then I want to visit with them a little bit about their loved one, asking them some basic questions. Where would the service be at? What type of service are they thinking of having? Are we thinking a traditional service with a casket viewing? Are we thinking a traditional service with cremation to follow? Are we thinking an immediate cremation with a memorial service? So we ask all those questions.
Unless you have it in the...
Unless we have it here, But sometimes, like in the middle of the night, for
Yeah.
instance, we might not be at home, but they'll tell us that.
Yeah.
And then we can go from that. But what we do is we make that initial call, see what they're thinking, and then we wanna set up a time for them to come in as a family, even if they have pretty much everything taken care of. But we wanna finalize those things, okay?
I gotta ask this question. You said police call you. How would they know to call George Boone instead of?
Because the family will typically be there
Oh.
to notify them, to let them know, but they're the ones that make the initial call.
Oh, the family wouldn't make the call, the police? would
Typically,
make
if
the
it's an
call.
unintended death, usually it's gonna be typically the police department or somebody from EMS will let us know. And then we make initial contact with the family when we get there. So, yeah.
They'll say, do you have a funeral home in town that you work with? And you'll say X, Y, or Z, and then they make the call for you.
Oh,
Yeah. And then basically too, after that, we always ask too, as far as, is there any church affiliation? Is there somebody that we should be contacting? Okay, I'll also ask, are they a veteran? Because then I'll say, well, then you need to bring in the DD 214, especially if they don't have a file here and we don't have it on record, we need the DD 214. And then I'll ask them as far as, if it's a man, do they have a beard or mustache or any of that? And that's just the fine details, because when we bring that individual under our care, we start our process immediately, okay? So if it's an embalming, that individual is gonna be brought back into our care, and we're gonna start that process. And if it's a man, for instance, we wanna know, do they have a mustache, or do they have a beard, or have they been in the hospital for a couple weeks and just growth? So we wanna know if we need to shave, or what we're saving, and so on. And then even if it's cremation, we still bring that individual back into our care. Everybody that we bring into our care, they're bathed, they're washed, they're shaved. And that's just automatic. That's for their dignity and respect before they're cremated. And then a lot of times we'll have family bring in clothing and undergarments, because we still wanna dress that person for their dignity and respect before they're cremated. And also they'll be dressed for when they come and view their loved one for the last time too, as a family. Okay, so all that starts from that initial phone call. And then one thing is the care of the deceased, the embalming process, the bathing and washing. You know, that may be a small part of what we do for the family, but that's one of the most important parts that we do for the family, because we're caring for their loved one. Any other questions before we start the tour? Okay, if you wanna follow me, well, obviously this is our Hope Chapel, what we call it. And then we can divide the rooms into, we have walls. So we have Harvest right here next to us, Centennial, and then Sunrise. So we can divide our rooms into 4 separate rooms, okay? Sometimes if we don't need a larger chapel, we might put this wall up. There's been times where we've had all the walls open, so we can see 500 people in here if we need to. But if it's a larger visitation, a lot of times what we'll do is the casket's here, and then what we do is we have the flow where individuals will just continue to walk around, look at pictures, flowers, and so on, and then they'll come and visit the family here. So we don't have a big line going here and going out. Okay. This way. There's an elevator downstairs, but I'll show you one of our waiting rooms. Let me just make sure I'm holding my computer. Yeah.
Hi there.
just to kind of show you what they look like. But we do have caskets here. We just don't show them on our floor. Okay. So if you come this way,
You guys walk a whole lot faster than me.
Will it be the same spots?
these are urn vaults. You know, you have the vaults for the caskets, which are larger, of course, but then these would be our urn vaults. So these are used for urns. Now there are certain cemeteries in the area that require, if you bury an urn, that they're required to be buried in an urn vault. Okay. And then these are what we would call some of our cremation containers. These are the type of containers that the individual would be placed in for private family viewing. Okay. And then this, for instance, is what we would call our rental casket. It's an oak casket. And basically the rental casket, the way that works is there's an insert that goes in that casket and it's replaced every time with interiors. So every time we use the casket, there's a new interior in there. And you just have the shell that always stays the same. Okay? And then what we do is when we take that interior out, the container that's in there with the individual, we would lower this end, and then we bring the container out as one with the individual in there, and that's what's going to be cremated with the individual. So the container that's inside this with the lining, the pillow, all that, that is cremated with the individual after the viewing. Now when you do a traditional service with cremation to follow, we've done it where we do a visitation the night before, and they want to have burial the same day. So then we would do cremation that evening, and then the urn would be present at the service, and then we could go do burial that same day. Or if they want the casket present with their loved one at the visitation at the service, then we wouldn't do burial typically until the next day. Okay? And then if you come over here, there's a variety of different urns to choose from. And you'll notice that we have urns that are in the motorcycle tank, golf ball, bobber, so bowling ball. So there's many different types of urns. There's
How about a book?
Actually, there are urns that are designed to look like books on a shelf.
You gotta satisfy the librarian audience.
It's very possible, and there are ones like that. So, and then they have what we call unity urns. Okay, this is where there's two sets of cremains in the urn. So you have unity urns, and then you know you have urns too that look like urns, or you have urns that you would never know there's cremated remains in there. Okay.
I'm a cheapskate. I want the cheapest one available so that the money that is left can go to something that's worthwhile.
Well, now that's very true, and you can do that. The only way that wouldn't happen is over time, basically what happens is if you enter a care facility, over time those assets become depleted, okay? And then over that time, if you eventually become under assistance from the state, what happens is those funds that aren't used goes back to the state. If you're not under assistance, then those assets can be.
No, I'm prepaid.
Yep. But it's just if that person goes under assistance, if those assets aren't used on the funeral, that's prepaid, then they would go back to the county or the state, depending on the situation. Now there are keepsakes too. So you have keepsakes where you can put a small portion of cremains in. Okay. There are scattering tubes. There are tubes that are designed that makes it easier for families to scatter cremains. These are just candles, and you can put cremains in there. There's also jewelry where you can put cremated remains in.